National Guard, meanwhile, continuing to arrive in D.C. from all across the country for Inauguration Day. Up to 20,000 could be there by next Wednesday. That's more than 3 times the number of U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Defense officials say Guard members are being briefed as if they're deploying to a war zone.
Irony is whenever something is funny. The funnier something is, the more ironic it is.
It's a sight I don't think that I thought that I would ever see in my lifetime. This idea of troops marching into the capital city of the United States of America, not for a parade and not to show off or be in a dog and pony show or anything like that, but literally being sent there to guard us. I don't know anything like this has happened since 1861, but it has got many people concerned about some things, and some of those people include me, as you can probably guess. This idea that we are deploying more troops, 3 times as many troops as we have in Iraq and Afghanistan combined, to defend the capital is concerning. I suppose it comes from, you have to believe certain things, and one of the things you would have to believe is that, number one, January 6th was an insurrection. I'm just going to put my cards on the table. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it was an insurrection at all. I don't believe it was barely a riot. But there are people who are consistently using those words, insurrection, and there's a reason why, folks. Language is important. Remember when we talked about the president talking about the invasion of the illegal immigrants? Remember that? And we went through this whole thing about the use of language and how we were using the term invasion. Well, the same thing is happening here with insurrection. There is a very specific reason why that term is being used, and how that term is being used is what has resulted in 20,000 troops, and might be up to 25,000 troops now, being deployed to the nation's capital for the sole purpose of protecting the inauguration of Joe Biden. Now, many of you might already be reacting to this going, but Dave, that seems like it flies in the face of Posse Comitatus. What is that, for those of you who don't know? Posse Comitatus is a law that we passed as a nation back in 1876, after the 1876 election, that forbade the use of the United States military forces, specifically at that time the Army, in enforcing domestic civilian policy, law enforcement policy. There were some reasons for that, very good reasons for that, at least in the eyes of the Bourbon Democrats. There were. Prior hitherto that time, the Army had been enforcing Reconstruction, and they didn't like that. And so getting rid of the Army meant that their own local sheriffs, because there weren't police departments yet, and no federal oversight of that, meant that they had control of that again. So this law has stayed with us for much of our time, but now all of a sudden, the National Guard being sent to the United States Capitol to enforce what is essentially domestic policy to protect an inauguration of a president. And this seems to fly in the face of that for some people. Well, the truth is there are exceptions to Posse Comitatus. Obviously, the first exception is the United States Coast Guard. The United States Coast Guard is not bound by Posse Comitatus because it wouldn't make any sense if they were. They were essentially a revenue cutter service that morphed into more than that. But even now, under the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Navy, because we are at war, quote unquote, the United States Coast Guard is still exempt from Posse Comitatus because it would make sense. The second exemption, major exemption, there are some minor ones, but the second major one is the United States Space Force. Not kidding. The Space Force was made exempt from Posse Comitatus because, quote, the Air Force is not able to enforce space law. Can't make this stuff up, folks. The third exemption, of course, is the one that is really important to us. There are some other minor ones, surveillance missions, support missions, that kind of stuff. Things that you don't really think about as law enforcement. But that insurrection, the insurrection of the people or a group of people, is a direct exemption to the idea of Posse Comitatus. It is a direct exemption to the idea that the military cannot be used. And so, this is why that word is being used over and over again by, well, particularly the Democrats. They are calling it an insurrection. The media is calling it an insurrection because they need it to be an insurrection in order to rationalize and justify the violation of Posse Comitatus. This is not unlike Republicans and conservatives using the word invasion to describe what the immigrant caravan was doing. It was not an invasion. It was not by any stretch of the imagination an invasion or use of the definition of the word, but we didn't care then, did we? We were okay with that. But now we're using the word insurrection to describe what happened on January 6th. And I had a whole tape of my own local media, people that are 3,000 miles from Washington, D.C., calling this an insurrection, insurrection, insurrection. Well, that doesn't happen without a reason. And that reason, of course, is Posse Comitatus and the use of the National Guard. There's another major exemption to this, and that exemption falls under something that is called the National Special Security Event. Ever hear of that? Well then, a National Special Security Event is an event which the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Defense, not the President, not the Department of the Treasury, which used to oversee the Secret Service, not Congress, the Department of Homeland Security determines meets some criteria. So even if it's not an insurrection per se, it can still be designated as a national security event, which means that the Department of Homeland Security can take some things into consideration. Are there dignitaries attending? And if they are, who are they? How big of a dignitary are they? I mean, if it's just Dave Bowman and his friends, that doesn't really count. But if it's the president, vice president, maybe that's important. The size of the event. How big is this event that's happening? How many people are expected to be there? How long does the event, what is the significance of the event? Is it, we're just signing something in the Rose Garden, or are we inaugurating a president? The duration of that event matters. How long will this event matter? And believe it or not, the inauguration, you might think it only lasts a day. According to the latest memo from the Department of Homeland Security, they have asked for the event, the inaugural event, to be designated as occurring from January 9th through January 27th. So it's quite a ways. One of the big considerations is multiple jurisdictions are involved. So here you would have the DC police, you would have the FBI, you would have the Secret Service, you have all these multiple jurisdictions, and so someone needs to oversee all that. So the Department of Homeland Security can designate this as a national special security event and take over jurisdiction. And of course, the actual threat assessment. What are we actually concerned about? Well, as you know, we are now concerned about the Trump supporters rioting and insurrecting and somehow or another preventing the inauguration of Joe Biden. All of this stuff gives broad authority to the Department of Homeland Security and the Secret Service, both. And it also allows the use of the National Guard to decide how things are going to be done at this national security, special security event, which, as you may have noticed, means we are sending troops into the Capitol and essentially turning it into the Green Zone in Baghdad. So how did we get to this thing, this national security event, this special security event? You ever hear of that? I mean, you may have. You've probably heard the term, but you really know how we got to this thing? Well, of course, it came from a response to increased terrorism threat. The idea that the nation was in danger, terrorists could hit anything at any time, and so special events needed to be protected. Super Bowls, Rolling Stones concerts, Celine Dion. She's French. Why would we care? That sort of thing. And so the president at the time issued the Presidential Decision Directive number 62. This is not an executive order. It is not a law. It's not even an instruction. It's a decision directive that means the president has decided that this is how we're going to do things. It was called number 62, Presidential Decision Directive number 62, and it was signed in May of 1998 by then President Bill Clinton. Congress looked at this and said, hey, that's a really great idea. We should codify that into a law. And so in January of 2000, days before George W. Bush was inaugurated, they passed and President Clinton signed the Presidential Protection Act of 2000, which sounds great, doesn't it? A Presidential Protection Act. Oh, we're going to protect the president. But it includes so much more, all those things we just talked about. This national special security event is contained in that law. It was passed, you would imagine, after much debate and argument in the Congress of the United States. The House, of course, beat this up one side and down the other. The Senate, there were filibusters and threats of filibusters, and they needed cloture. Well, that's what you would think would happen, right? I mean, we're talking about a law here that essentially allows the government to, well, do what they're doing in Washington, D.C. right now. And that weird feeling in the back of your neck that this feels weird. You would think somebody in Congress would want to talk about that, right? Huh. It was passed by voice vote in the House. In other words, there is no public record of the vote of the House of Representatives. It's just, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? We don't know. There was virtually no debate, and it passed. In the Senate, it passed by what is known as unanimous consent. Unanimous consent, meaning, again, no voice vote. No votes were actually counted. There's no record of it. You don't know how your senator voted or not voted or didn't even show up. It passed on a voice vote, unanimous consent in the Senate, and ta-da, the president, to nobody's surprise, signed it. And so there we go, the Presidential Protection Act of 2000, which includes this idea of the National Special Security Event, which we're now seeing unfold before our very eyes. There are some questions, however, that still remain, at least in my mind. This concept of using the National Guard in the way we're using it, and I'm sorry, maybe it's the Goliard in me, maybe I'm watching what's happening, maybe it's the shock in what's happening, and I'm watching this. The idea here is that the inauguration of Joe Biden is in grave danger. Grave danger. Is there any other kind? Grave danger, right? You asked if there was any other kind. I said, no, that whole thing from that. But I'm sorry, I don't really believe that. I don't really believe that were the National Guard not guarding Washington, D.C. to this degree, that there would be a major uprising and an insurrection on January 21st would happen is absurd to me. I'm sorry. I think that's fantasy. I believe that that's fantasy. I believe that that's something that some people want to have happen, but I want the Broncos to win the Super Bowl, and that ain't going to happen either. We have allowed ourselves to create in our mind a boogeyman, and now that boogeyman requires us to react. And in much the same way the Patriot Act overreacted to security concerns in the early 2000s, and we're still being punished with that. This Presidential Protection Act of 2000 has led to what is essentially the green zone in Washington, D.C., the green zone and red zone, where Washington, D.C. is literally locked down behind walls and barbed wire and controlled access points. And nobody seems to be batting an eye at this. Nobody seems to be, wait, what? The intriguing thing about this to me is that the Army is being pushed by the Democrats in Congress to screen the troops. For COVID, you might say? No. They want every one of those 25,000 troops screened for their political extremist views or sympathies. And the Army basically said, what are we supposed to do here? You want us to actually comb through 25,000 people's social media and everything else to figure out if they're no, we're not doing that. I'm not making that up, folks. That's what they wanted, and the Army said, we can't do that, sorry. One of them turns out to be an extremist, well. But it raises that question to me about, we've always held this long-held belief that the military is homogeneously conservative. And its loyalty, it's to the oath of the Constitution, not the people in power. That has been a long-held belief that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, Space Force, the Coast Guard, would refuse to carry out directives that were unconstitutional, although that's an argument that I love to have, because that's an argument you get into, well, what's an unconstitutional order? Coming from a bunch of 18-year-olds that have never even read the Constitution, how would they know? But we've always held this belief that the Army would be on the side of the people, that the military would side with we the people in such a situation as this. But now I'm looking at what's going on here, and I'm wondering, is that necessarily true? Would this National Guard, I mean, keep in mind, we've had incidents in our country where the National Guard, specifically the National Guard, did not side with the people. You can blame training, you can blame stress, you can blame all kinds of things. But the truth of the matter was that when push came to shove, they shot at the people of the United States of America. This concept concerns me because I'm looking at this going, ooh, it's weird. It's just weird. And I'm not sure how I would feel were I one of those troops, especially given my own considerations right now of anti-federalist thinking. It raises the question, and it raises, in my mind, this thought of irony. I remember Alanis Morissette sung that song. Isn't it ironic, talking about, black fly in your Chardonnay and rain on your wedding day and those kinds of things. But is there really anything more ironic than this concept of a peaceful transference of power backed up by 25,000 troops? Is that really a peaceful transfer of power? I mean, is it? We were told in 2017 that riots and pussy hats and screaming and shouting and throwing bricks and setting cars on fire and tearing up hotels and that sort of thing was just fine by the people. That's just the people expressing themselves. That's what happened on Inauguration Day in 2017, remember? Oh, you don't remember? You can go back in my memories on Facebook, assuming you haven't been kicked off social media yet, or you could try to find videos of it. Maybe harder than you think, but the Office of Mini True has kind of gotten to some of that stuff. But it did happen. But now in 2021, we're told that kind of stuff is unacceptable. That kind of stuff is insurrection and requires a militarized response from the government of the United States to protect itself against the ideas that people might be willing to not agree with them. And I'm left to wonder if anybody in the world, anybody other than me, sees the irony of needing 25,000 troops to protect the peaceful transition of power.